In this unit, we're going to start to look at social interaction. Certainly one of the most interesting topics, as I think so much is applicable and relevant to your day-to-day lives. So when we talk about social interaction is really just two or more people taking one another into account. Certainly there's a lot of context that goes into any social interaction. Sometimes it's the physical place. Are you in a very quiet library? Are you outside in a big busy park? Or maybe it's the activity itself. Are you at the opera? Or are you at a baseball game? Either one of those scenarios certainly will dictate and change the interaction. The environment in terms of social dynamics. Do you know everybody you're with, or is this a bunch of strangers you just met at a bus stop? Certainly those things can factor into how the interaction plays out. Often too, we talk about status and roles when we talk about social interaction. Status is simply your socially defined positions that people occupy or hold. Things like being a mother, being a brother, being a student, being the boss. Those are all socially defined positions. Roles are all of the behaviors associated with a status. So for example, if you were a student, maybe taking notes, showing up to your classes, doing homework, all of those are roles. And in fact, in that example, that's a role set, all the collective roles attached to any one status. Statuses can also be ascribed, meaning that they are given to you at birth or by the virtue of birth, such as your age, such as your sex, your race, your ethnicity. Your age itself is also ascribed. You can't readily change that. But then in sociology, we also look at what are the achieved statuses, meaning those that are gained as a result of your individual actions. Maybe you were promoted at work. Maybe you recently learned a new language. Those could all be achieved statuses. So let's take a look at an example. Here we've got Winnie. Winnie has multiple statuses. She's the vice president of a bank, she's a wife, she's a mother, and a daughter. In the world of Winnie, you can see here she has different role sets. Again, all the roles attached to any one particular status. Sometimes when you have a role set with multiple roles, you can feel what we call role strain. In the case of Winnie, let's take a look at some of her statuses and the related roles as mother. For Winnie, she may have the role of babysitter as mom, right? Taking care of the kids. But she also may have to help her other daughter with math homework. And in that scenario, she's only got so much time. Well, that is what we would refer to as role strain, meaning that there's only so much time in the day and that there can be a real tension between where you're spending that time. So within the particular role set, that's role strain. Sometimes though it's not within, it's when the roles of multiple statuses start to compete. So what if it's that Winnie in fact is still that babysitting mom, but then she's also got to go take care of her own elder mother? Well, sometimes that can create a real conflict, right? She's got to take care of both mom, her own kids. Where does she find the time? That's when you have role conflict, when the roles attached to two different statuses are starting to come in conflict with each other. And often this is causing stress. This might cause you to have to make choices, trade-offs. We all feel both role strain and role conflict in our very busy lives. And this just summarizes again that role strain is when it's in a single role versus role conflict is two or more statuses and having conflicting demands. So interestingly, this chapter also starts to dive into a little bit around collective behavior. And really collective behavior is relatively spontaneous social actions that occur when people respond to unstructured and ambiguous situations. We're going to take a look at a few of these and some special considerations. Now in today's society, we have what we call dispersed forms of social media. That's like YouTube, Twitter, Pinterest, Facebook. Those are all relatively new in the sense of sociological exploration. Before, when we talked about traditional media, it often meant magazines, newspapers, television. Now it's really looking at an entire web, not just literally of the social web, but also the interactive multimedia World Wide Web, as well as the Internet of Things, all of those factors. We also have fake news now as a collective behavior, and it's going to be interesting to see how fake news plays out over the next few years, and understanding when news is considered real and objective versus when news maybe isn't. When we talk about collective behavior, we also talk about the various types. And so crowds is a great example. Crowds are a collection of people or a concentration of people focused on something or event, but are also very much attuned to one another's behavior. A crowd is not necessarily a bad thing, but if it becomes an acting crowd, meaning a group aroused by a focal event, often with a shared purpose, and they feed off the energy of others present, that's when you want to really start to take note. So here in this example, you see kind of a protest. That certainly would be a crowd that has become an acting crowd. They're acting towards some purpose or motivation. More concerning is actually a threatened crowd. That's when an acting crowd has been put into a state of alarm. There's a belief that something is going on where your own life is in danger. Anytime that happens, a threatened crowd is very unstable and may make actions that are very non-rational, very rushed, and may lead to panic. Conversely, you also have crowds that gather for the sheer purpose of personal gratification in the participation. Some great examples of this are actually Burning Man. It's an event held out in the desert, very esoteric. Folks are able to have a very art-filled kind of gratification through participating in this event. It's the event in and of itself and the collective participation that gives the crowd its expressiveness. Not a bad thing necessarily, but certainly there's patterns of social behavior to look at in that. Sometimes you also have a very conventional crowd, and that's really behavior that's going to conform to generally established cultural norms. Gratification results from passive appreciation of the event. Think of a crowd watching the opera. That's a very conventional crowd. They aren't going to share in this very esoteric communal thing, but rather they want to appreciate it within the rules and confines. So how do you know if it's going to lead to panic? Well, panic is flight from our perceived danger, and there are a number of factors, and these are not in your text. Critical is if there's an element of fear or disorganization in a crowd. That definitely can start to put in place some of the elements of panic. But four of the factors that most commonly come up in a true sociological panic are these. Partial entrapment. If you believe that there's some way in which you may or may not get out of that physical environment or social environment, that's when panic starts to set in. If there's a perceived threat of intensity, meaning that this situation is escalating, I can feel it's heated, I can feel tensions are running high, that can start to quickly escalate a situation. If there's a partial or complete escape or breakdown of your escape routes, that's a really big factor. So in a scenario, everything could be going fine if there's multiple exits people can see, but the moment their path to those exits starts to break down, it can often lead to panic. And finally, if there's this should be front to rear communication failure, meaning that the folks at the front of the crowd can't get messages to the back of the crowd starts panicking, pushing, and will often lead to some type of disorganization and failure. So think about social interaction and think about all the different groups and dynamics of those groups. It's a very complicated area and one that definitely is relevant to our everyday lives, and hopefully some of the pieces on role conflict and role strain help you to better understand some of these concepts.